In this recording, I'm going to talk about how to use nested for loops to print out the data in a two-dimensional array. So in the prior recordings, I've dealt with one-dimensional arrays and for loops. I've dealt with how to set up two-dimensional arrays and how to look at the coordinates for row and column and figure out which piece of information you're looking at. So row 0, column 0 is the name Jack. Row 0, column 1 is the grade of 12. Row 1, column 0 is the name Jane. Row 1, column 1 is the 11, the grade. And then finally, row 2, column 0 is the name Adam, and row 2, column 1 would print out the grade of 10. Now, if you want to do that using a for loop instead of having to actually put hard code all those row and column values in print statements, we can do that. So here I've basically set up the array and I've set up Jack 12, Jane 11, and Adam 10 just as they would look here. I have set it up exactly like this. So in memory, this is how the data appears in this two-dimensional format with a column of names and then a column of grades with 3 rows for Jack, Jane, and Adam. So that's what this does. It just puts the values in the array. And of course I could have used a scanner and a for loop, nested for loops for those of you who are advanced programmers. But now when I want to print the values out, I'm going to have to use 2 for loops to do that. Now because I am putting the first for loop, the outermost for loop, using the rows, I am going to be walking this by row. And what I mean by that is I'm going to go to row 0 and print everything on row 0. So if I had 5 columns, I would be printing all of those columns. I would be printing this entire row. I'm going to print all of Jack's data. Then I'm going to go to the next row and I'm going to print all of Jane's data, her name and grade, and then I'm going to go to the next row and print Adam's name and grade. So I am walking the array by row. I'm going to the first row and printing everything, second row print everything, third row print everything. And I control that by making the outermost of the 2 for loops. I have 2 dimensions, so I need 2 for loops, 1 to walk each dimension. I'm going to make rows the outer driving loop, and that is what is going to control the fact that it's going to go row by row. So I'm going to put rows first, and I don't like to use letters when I'm dealing with a two-dimensional array in my for loop. I'll actually use row and col as my loop variables so that I can keep them straight when I'm trying to look at the loop and debug it. So here I'm going to go for my 3 rows, and remember they're rows 0, 1, and 2. So I've got to loop while the value in row is 0, 1, and 2. As soon as it gets to 3, I've got to stop. So I'm going for less than 3 here. Now I want to tell it after it goes to the first row, go to the first column and then the second column. So I'm going to have it loop while the column value is less than 2 because my columns are numbered 0 and 1. I have 3 rows and 2 columns, so as long as I use less than here and not less than equals but actually just less than, I will be fine. So I can use the dimension or the number of rows here and the number of columns here with the less than symbol, and I won't get any index out of bounds errors if I do that. I cannot use less than equals on either of these or I will get that error. Okay, so I've got 3 rows numbered 0, 1, and 2 and 2 columns numbered 0 and 1. When I put my print line, I put it inside that innermost loop, and I'm going to have it print out each piece of information. And so what happens here is each time this loop executes, this one runs twice. So for every one time the outer row executes, the inner row runs twice because I have two columns. So when the row is 0, the innermost loop says go to column 0 and get the name Jack and print it out. Then loop a second time, bump up that column number by 1. The row is still 0. Now the column number is 1 and print out the 12. When it's done with that, it comes back to the row here and it prints, and row becomes a 1. Now it comes in here, it goes back to column 0. So row is 1, column is 0, it prints out Jane. Then that inner loop runs again, the column becomes 1, the row is still 1 here, and it prints out the 11. Now the row goes to 2. This loop cycles back for the third time. This thing's going to run twice because it's going to go to row 2, column 0 and print Adam. Then it's still row 2, but the column number is 1 and it prints 10. So for each one time this runs, this thing runs twice because there are 2 columns per row. So the inner loop goes twice for every one time the outer row goes. So if this thing executes 3 times for rows 0, 1, and 2, which is what it does, this thing executes 6 times, right? Because it's going to go row 0, 1, 2, row 2, 1, 2, row 3, 1, 2. So this thing runs 6 times while this outer loop only runs 3 times. So what happens again, I've got to be very clear on this. The first time we come in, the row is 0, the column is 0. This thing loops a second time. The row still stays 0, the column goes to 1. Then the inner loop is done. It comes back to the outer loop. It changes the row to 1. The column number resets to 0. Then it goes to 1. The inner loop is done. It comes back here. This row becomes a 2. This loop has reset column back to 0. Then column goes to 1. Now at that point it is complete. It goes back here. The row would actually be a 3. We know that the loop will stop once the row gets to be 3 because 3 is not less than 3. And then the inner loop is done as well. If the outer loop isn't running, the inner loop isn't running. There's a dependency here. This thing has to be executing or still going in order for this thing to go. So once this stops, the inner loop is by default done as well, and everything's done with the loop. Now I did it as a print so it would all print on one line. Here's the thing, if I put a print line here, I'm going to get every single thing on a separate line. I get Jack 12, Jane 11, Adam 10, and they're all on separate lines. For those who are advanced programmers, you can experiment with putting a print line in the outer loop, and again, we're not worrying about that for people who are novice programmers, but you can experiment with putting a print line in the outer loop and see how it breaks your output up. Now that was walking the rows. I went by row here, okay, because my outer loop is going by row. I can also flip it around. I can walk the columns. And we'll see how the output changes by making the column the outer driving loop and making rows the inner loop. Notice this is still row col order here. I do not ever flip the order of the coordinates or the numbers here. Row is always first, column is always second. What I change is which loop is first. The one that's going through the columns or the one that's going through the rows, okay? So now, when we print out, let's see how the output looks a little bit different here. I got all of the names, then I got all of the grades, which makes sense. If I'm telling it to go column 0, and then row 0, row 1, row 2, I'm going to get all of the names. Then I tell it to go to column 1, to go back to row 0, row 1, row 2, and I get all the grades. So now, for every one time this executes, this thing runs 3 times. So column 0 runs 3 times on the inner loop. The outer loop runs a second time. For column 1, this thing runs 3 times. So this thing runs 6 times, this inner loop runs 6 times, the outer loop runs twice. Okay, so I know that's a lot to think about. I'm not going to deal with diagonals yet because I want you to understand that you can walk an array several different ways. You can go by row or by column, and it all depends on what you put as the outer driving loop when you nest these for loops. So think about that. Watch this recording a couple times if you need to, but you have to understand the different ways that you can walk it, and it's all controlled by the loop. And again, I can't stress enough, just because I have columns in the first loop and rows in the second, I do not put column first and row second here. It is always row call in that order when you're grabbing them out of the array. It's just how you flip the loops around that determines whether you're going across by row or down by column.